Welcome to this remarkable frontier chronicle, where forgotten wisdom and unexpected innovation collide with tradition in ways that would forever change the course of local history. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're listening from and the exact time of day or night you found this story. It's always fascinating to see how far these frontier tales travel and when they reach you. The winter of 1842 was particularly harsh across the Ohio River Valley. Snow had fallen for 3 consecutive days, burying paths between homesteads under 2 feet of white silence. Most farmers had expected a typical winter, moderate by frontier standards, and had prepared accordingly. All except for Silas Hammond, whose meticulous habits had earned him subtle mockery from neighbors who considered his excessive preparations a waste of precious summer hours that could have been spent clearing additional acreage. Hammond's modest cabin stood at the northern edge of Clearfield County, Pennsylvania, set against a backdrop of pine forest that stretched toward the mountains. While most settlers in the area maintained a standard woodpile that would see them through an average winter, Hammond's woodshed contained nearly 3 cords of seasoned oak and maple, stacked with geometric precision. But it wasn't just the quantity of his firewood that differentiated Hammond from his neighbors. It was his obsession with light. A man unprepared for darkness is unprepared for life, Hammond would say when questioned about the hours he spent collecting pine knots and fat wood throughout summer and fall. While others considered a modest supply of tallow candles sufficient, Hammond's cabin housed an extensive collection of lighting implements. A sturdy wooden rack mounted near the chimney held dozens of pine knots ready to be lit. Glass bottles of rendered bear fat and deer tallow lined a shelf. Crude clay dishes fashioned into simple Betty lamps sat ready for use, and hanging from the ceiling beams were bundles of rushes, carefully peeled and dried for making rushlights. The neighboring Wilkinson family had chuckled at Hammond's preparation when passing his property in autumn. Samuel Wilkinson had called over the fence, planning to light the whole county through winter. Hammond had merely nodded and continued his work sorting pine knots by size and resin content. The Wilkinsons, like many in Clearfield County, relied primarily on the hearth fire and a modest supply of tallow candles made during slaughtering season. Why waste precious time collecting pine knots and rushes when simple candles had served well enough? Hammond's obsession with lighting had begun decades earlier, during his time as a young man traveling with fur trappers in the Northern Territories. In the winter of 1801, Hammond had witnessed an entire expedition nearly perish when their candle supply was damaged during a river crossing. The men had struggled for weeks in near total darkness, unable to repair equipment, prepare food properly, or even maintain their mental faculties in the endless gloom. Only the intervention of a Native American guide, who taught them to use pine knots and animal fat for illumination, had saved the party. Hammond never forgot the lesson. Darkness is more than inconvenience, he would later write in his journal. It is a thief of time, of productivity, of sanity itself. A man can survive 3 weeks without food, 3 days without water, but spend 3 hours in complete darkness, and the mind begins to fray. Light is not a luxury, it is essential as breath. Unlike many settlers who viewed indigenous knowledge with suspicion or disdain, Hammond had embraced the lighting techniques taught by his native guide. Over the years, he had systematically collected and refined these methods, supplementing them with European practices and his own innovations. His interest had bordered on scientific, with careful notations about burning times, illumination quality, and material requirements for each lighting method. The first blizzard of 1842 struck 3 days before Christmas. The Hammonds, Silas, his wife Martha, and his elderly mother Agnes, watched from their windows as snow obscured the landscape. That same evening, as darkness fell early on the shortest days of the year, the Wilkinsons realized their candle supply would not last through January if used at the usual rate. Samuel Wilkinson, in a moment of frontier practicality, decided to ration light. Only one candle would be lit each evening, and only for essential tasks. The family would otherwise rely on the hearth fire, which meant activities would be confined to its immediate vicinity. The Wilkinsons were not alone in their predicament. Throughout Clearfield County, families were making similar calculations as the severity of the winter became apparent. At the Johnson homestead 4 miles east of the Hammond property, Edward Johnson announced that reading and needlework would be suspended until spring. The candles must be preserved for cooking and emergency medical care. At the Cooper farm, candle-making supplies were inventoried with growing concern. They had tallow enough for perhaps 20 additional candles, assuming they slaughtered one of their precious milk cows, an option they hoped to avoid. By January 10th, the Wilkinsons had exhausted half their candle supply. The snow had not relented, and paths to nearby homesteads remained impassable. Through the white haze, they could see the Hammond cabin glowing each evening, warm light spilling from each window. Samuel Wilkinson observed that Silas Hammond moved about his property after dark, carrying what appeared to be a torch that burned brightly despite the falling snow. "It's peculiar," Samuel remarked to his wife Sarah, as they huddled near their hearth. "Hammond has light to spare while we ration candles like gold dust." Perhaps there was method in his madness after all. It was on January 18th that the situation grew dire for many in Clearfield County. A second blizzard had isolated households for nearly a month. Candle supplies dwindled dangerously low, and many families now spent their evenings in near darkness, huddled around hearth fires that provided heat but minimal light. The Wilkinson family had resorted to burning green pine branches, which smoked excessively and provided only brief, sputtering illumination. "Our eyes burn worse than our throats," Sarah Wilkinson confided to her journal by firelight. "The smoke is unbearable, but darkness is worse." Samuel attempted to write correspondence today and could barely make out the lines on the paper. "How will we endure until spring?" Meanwhile, at the Hammond cabin, life continued with surprising normalcy. Each evening, Martha Hammond could be seen through the windows mending clothing or reading from the family Bible. Agnes Hammond worked on her intricate quilt patterns despite her failing eyesight, and Silas maintained his account books with the same diligence as during summer months. Their home remained a beacon of light in the increasingly dark valley. Hammond's lighting system operated with remarkable efficiency. Each morning, he selected appropriate lighting materials for the day's needs: pine knots for bright, temporary illumination, rush lights for background lighting, Betty lamps for a consistent, longer-term light, and precious spermaceti candles reserved for tasks requiring the clearest, brightest illumination. Nothing was wasted. Even the drippings from one lighting source were collected to fuel another. On January 23rd, Sarah Wilkinson developed a persistent cough that gradually worsened. By nightfall, her breathing had grown labored, and Samuel found himself in an impossible situation. His wife needed constant attention throughout the night, but their last 2 candles had to be preserved for absolute emergencies. In desperation, Samuel Wilkinson trudged through knee-deep snow to the Hammond property. The journey was treacherous. Drifts had buried familiar landmarks, and the bitter cold penetrated even his heaviest woolen clothing. Several times Samuel nearly turned back, but thoughts of his ailing wife propelled him forward. After nearly an hour of struggling through the snow, he spotted the warm glow of the Hammond cabin through the trees. Silas Hammond answered his knock promptly, a pine knot torch in hand that cast a bright, steady light across the snow. "Samuel," he said without surprise, "I've been expecting someone." Inside the Hammond cabin, Samuel Wilkinson observed an array of lighting methods in simultaneous use. A rush light holder on the table supported a thin reed that burned with modest but adequate light. Near the hearth, a Betty lamp, a simple iron dish filled with animal fat, supported a twisted cotton wick that provided a steady flame. Mounted on the wall, a pine knot burned in an iron holder, the resinous wood giving off a bright, almost smokeless light. "I need help," Samuel admitted, shivering as the warmth of the cabin began to thaw his frozen clothing. Sarah is ill, and we've nearly exhausted our candles. Without hesitation, Hammond gathered supplies, several pine knots of various sizes, a bundle of prepared rushes, a small jar of rendered deer tallow, and a simple iron Betty lamp of his own making. As he worked, he explained to Samuel the frontier lighting methods that had become second nature to him. "These pine knots," Hammond said, selecting a particularly resinous specimen, "are the heart of old stumps, saturated with pitch. The Indians taught the first settlers to use them. They'll light even when damp and burn hot and bright for nearly an hour. The resin acts like nature's lamp oil." He demonstrated how to split the knots to expose the most resinous sections, then showed Samuel how to mount them in simple holders to catch dripping pitch. "Keep them in the fireplace corner on flat stones," he advised, "to avoid smoke in the room and pitch dripping on your floors." Samuel examined the pine knot, noting its substantial weight and rich amber color. "I've seen these in the forest countless times," he admitted, "but never thought to use them for lighting." "The best resources often go unnoticed," Hammond replied. The first settlers nearly starved while standing amidst abundance, simply because they didn't recognize what was valuable in this new world. Next, Hammond displayed the rushes he had collected from the marshy area beyond his property. "Rushlight is the poor man's candle," he explained, showing how the outer skin had been peeled away, except for a single strip that provided structure to the soft pith inside. "We soaked these in leftover kitchen grease. Bacon fat works well, though mutton tallow hardens better. A good rush will burn for 40 minutes if properly prepared." He demonstrated the preparation process, deftly peeling a fresh rush while leaving a narrow support strip intact. "The rushes must be gathered in summer when they're green and pliable," he explained. "Soak them first to keep them from breaking, then peel them carefully. Dry them thoroughly before dipping them in fat." Hammond continued his impromptu education as he packed the supplies. "The Betty lamp is older than our grandfather's, simple but effective. Any fat will do, though bear grease burns with less smoke. The secret is in the wick. Twisted cotton is best, but linen will serve. Keep it trimmed and the lamp will burn clean." Samuel examined the crude iron lamp with newfound respect. He had seen similar devices in other households, but had dismissed them as primitive compared to proper candles. Now, with his wife ill and his home dark, the simple technology seemed invaluable. As they stepped outside, Hammond handed Samuel a final item, a carefully wrapped package containing 6 spermaceti candles, prized for their clean, burning properties and bright light. "These were traded from a whaling merchant who passed through last spring," Hammond explained. "I've kept them for emergencies. Your wife's health certainly qualifies." Samuel attempted to refuse the generous gift, knowing the value of such candles, but Hammond insisted. "Light is not a possession to be hoarded," he said firmly. "It is a resource to be shared when needed most." The journey back to the Wilkinson cabin seemed shorter, the path illuminated by Hammond's pine knot torch that burned steadily despite the falling snow. Upon arrival, Hammond spent an hour setting up the various lighting implements and instructing the family in their use. He showed them how to trim wicks properly, how to position the lights for maximum effectiveness, and how to prepare additional rushlights from the materials he had provided. Sarah Wilkinson, propped up in bed, watched with evident relief as light gradually filled the cabin that had been shrouded in gloom for weeks. "It's like the sun has risen indoors," she whispered, her voice hoarse from coughing. Before leaving, Hammond paused at the door. "Light isn't a luxury, Samuel. It's a necessity for mind and spirit, same as food for the body. When spring comes, I'll show you where to find the best pine knots and rushes." That night the Wilkinson cabin remained lit throughout the darkness. Sarah was tended properly, her breathing monitored, and medicinal tea administered at regular intervals. By morning, her condition had improved slightly, whether from the medicines or from the psychological lift provided by adequate light, Samuel couldn't say with certainty, but he found himself profoundly grateful for Hammond's knowledge and generosity. The next day, Samuel experimented with the lighting methods Hammond had demonstrated. The pine knots proved remarkably effective. A single knot, properly positioned, provided enough light to illuminate the main room for nearly an hour. The rushlights, while less bright, burned steadily and required minimal attention. The Betty lamp, once he became accustomed to trimming the wick correctly, produced a consistent light that served for routine tasks. Over the following week, as Sarah's condition gradually improved, Samuel found himself reflecting on the importance of light in ways he had never before considered. The simple ability to see clearly after sundown transformed the confined isolation of winter from oppressive imprisonment to productive retreat. Evenings that had once been passed in restless boredom could now be dedicated to mending equipment, writing correspondence, or simply reading for pleasure and edification. Hammond was right, Samuel noted in his journal. Light is not merely convenience. It is essential to both productivity and sanity during these long winter months. How curious that we prioritize food, water, and shelter, yet give so little thought to illumination until darkness descends. Word of Hammond's lighting method spread quickly through Clearfield County as the winter progressed. Neighbors who had once dismissed his preparations now sought his knowledge. Hammond never refused, freely sharing both supplies and expertise. By February, many cabins had adopted his methods, particularly the use of pine knots and rushlights, which could be readily made from available materials. The harsh winter continued through February and into March. When supplies of animal tallow ran low, Hammond introduced another frontier lighting method, the use of bayberry wax. He had collected the small, waxy berries during autumn and rendered them into a greenish wax that produced candles with a pleasant aroma and remarkably little smoke. Though time-consuming to make, it took approximately 4 pounds of berries to yield 1 pound of wax. These bayberry candles became highly valued, particularly for illuminating sick rooms. The process is laborious, Hammond explained to a group of neighbors who had gathered to learn the technique, but the results justify the effort. Bayberry candles burn cleaner than tallow, with a pleasant scent, rather than the greasy odor of animal fat. They're particularly valued for sick rooms, where harsh smells might aggravate a patient's condition. He demonstrated the entire process, boiling the berries in water, skimming the waxy substance that rose to the surface, straining it through linen, and then carefully forming candles by repeated dipping of wicks into the melted wax. The neighbors watched with rapt attention, taking notes and asking questions about specific techniques. As supplies dwindled further, Hammond revealed yet another method, lamps fueled by rendered fish oil, a technique he had learned from a traveler who had spent time in coastal fishing communities. Though the oil produced an unpleasant odor, it burned efficiently and could be made from preserved fish when fresh game was scarce. The smell is admittedly offensive, Hammond acknowledged as he demonstrated the fish oil lamp to a somewhat skeptical audience. But in circumstances where other fuels are unavailable, the choice becomes simple: endure an unpleasant odor or sit in darkness. I have found that adding a few drops of pine resin to the oil somewhat masks the fish smell, though it does not eliminate it entirely. Hammond also demonstrated the proper way to make a slut lamp, a crude but effective light source made by simply placing a twisted rag wick into a small container of melted fat. Not elegant, he admitted, but when other options fail, even the poorest light is better than complete darkness. For outdoor illumination during nighttime chores, Hammond introduced the concept of the farmer's lantern, a tin container with holes punched in specific patterns to allow light to escape while protecting the flame from wind. These simple lanterns could accommodate various light sources, candles, rushlights, or small pine knots, depending on what was available and how much illumination was needed. The knowledge-sharing sessions gradually evolved into community gatherings that served multiple purposes: practical education, social interaction during the isolating winter months, and collective problem-solving as new challenges emerged. Families brought their own lighting innovations to share, and Hammond encouraged this exchange, recognizing that diverse perspectives often yielded superior solutions. By late March, when the snow finally began to recede, the community had transformed its approach to lighting. Families who had once relied solely on tallow candles now maintained diverse lighting methods. Collecting pine knots became a regular activity during woodland excursions. Men and women learned to identify and gather the right rushes during summer months. Knowledge that had been forgotten or overlooked, wisdom that stretched back to indigenous practices and early colonial adaptations, had been revitalized by necessity. The winter's experience had profound effects on household architecture and design throughout Clearfield County. Cabins that had once featured minimal windows, a practical concession to heat conservation, began to incorporate more generous glazing to admit precious daylight. Interior walls were whitewashed to reflect and amplify available light. Mirrors, once considered luxury items, became valued tools for redirecting light into darker corners of living spaces. In April 1843, as the community gathered for the first church service since deep winter, Reverend Mitchell acknowledged the transformation. "We have learned much from this winter," he declared to the assembled congregation, "not least that wisdom often resides in preparation rather than reaction. The darkness that might have overwhelmed us instead revealed our capacity for adaptation and mutual support." He gestured toward Silas Hammond, seated modestly in a back pew. "We are fortunate to have among us those who maintain old knowledge even as progress tempts us to discard traditional ways." Perhaps the greatest lesson of this winter is that true advancement comes not from replacing the old with the new, but from maintaining diverse options to meet diverse challenges. Samuel Wilkinson, standing with his now recovered wife, nodded in agreement. The winter had changed him profoundly. He had already begun constructing a proper storage shed for his own lighting materials and had scheduled a journey with Silas Hammond to collect pine knots from recently cleared land to the north. "I once thought Hammond peculiar for his obsession with light," Samuel confided to a neighbor after the service. "Now I consider myself fortunate to have such wisdom nearby." This winter would have been far darker, both literally and figuratively, without his knowledge. The winter's experiences had far-reaching effects throughout the community. Homes were redesigned to maximize natural light during daylight hours. Windows, once considered luxuries that compromised heat retention, were added to north-facing walls with ingenious shuttering systems that could be closed during the coldest nights, yet opened to admit precious daylight. Interiors were whitewashed to reflect and amplify available light. Mirrors, once considered vanity items, were repositioned to bounce light deeper into living spaces. Even agricultural practices shifted subtly. Families began to plant sunflowers along garden edges, not only for their edible seeds, but for the oil that could be pressed from them, oil that burned with a clean, bright flame in properly designed lamps. Bayberry bushes were transplanted from wild areas to home gardens, ensuring reliable access to the waxy berries. Beef and mutton tallow, once considered merely a byproduct of slaughter, was now carefully rendered and stored specifically for lighting purposes. Summer brought new developments to Clearfield County. A merchant from Pittsburgh established a regular route through the area, bringing with him innovations in lighting technology. Whale oil lamps, with their brighter, cleaner flame, became available to those who could afford them. Spermaceti, the prized waxy substance from sperm whaleheads, made its way into specialized candles that burned with unprecedented brightness. The merchant reported that whale oil was becoming increasingly expensive, nearly $1.30 to $2.50 per gallon, as demand outpaced supply and whaling ships had to venture farther into dangerous waters to find their quarry. "The whaling industry is changing," the merchant informed interested customers. "The easy hunting grounds near shore have been depleted. Ships now spend years at sea venturing into treacherous Arctic waters or around Cape Horn into the Pacific. Each voyage costs more and yields less, driving prices ever higher." Despite the appeal of these commercial lighting options, most Clearfield County families maintained their diverse, locally sourced lighting methods. Whale oil might burn brighter, but at a cost that could feed a family for a month. Spermaceti candles might produce less smoke, but the skills to make rushes and render tallow cost nothing but time and effort. The community had discovered a truth about frontier resilience. Dependency on imported goods, however superior, created vulnerability that local self-sufficiency avoided. In 1844, Ezra Thornton, a particularly prosperous farmer, imported an argand lamp, a revolutionary design invented in 1780 by Swiss physicist Aimé Argand. The lamp featured a hollow circular wick that allowed air to flow both inside and outside the flame, resulting in more complete combustion and significantly brighter light. The argand lamp, fueled by whale oil, produced illumination equivalent to the light of 6 to 10 candles, transforming Thornton's ability to work after dark. Thornton proudly displayed his acquisition at a community gathering. The lamp's brilliance impressed all who saw it. The light was steadier and brighter than anything produced by traditional methods. Yet the practical frontier mindset quickly assessed its limitations. The lamp was expensive, required specific maintenance knowledge, and depended on costly imported oil. While admiring the technology, most neighbors recognized it as a luxury rather than a practical solution for everyday lighting needs. "It's remarkable," Thornton reported at the gathering. "With this lamp, I can read the finest print in my account books without straining my eyes. Even better, the light remains steady, no flickering to cause headaches." "And how much whale oil does it consume?" Hammond inquired politely. Thornton hesitated before responding. "About half a pint per evening of use. At current prices, that's approximately 12 cents per night." A murmur rippled through the assembled neighbors. 12 cents represented a significant expenditure for most frontier households, equivalent to a day's wages for farm labor. Hammond nodded thoughtfully but made no further comment, allowing the economic reality to speak for itself. Yet these technological advances came with considerable cost. Whale oil sold for over $1 per gallon, a substantial sum for frontier families. Spermaceti candles commanded premium prices that placed them beyond reach of most households. As a result, while wealthier settlers embraced these innovations, most families in Clearfield County continued to rely on the methods Silas Hammond had championed, methods that required more preparation but far less financial outlay. The community's lighting practices evolved to incorporate both old and new technologies, creating a unique hybrid approach. Ordinary evenings might be illuminated by rushlights and pine knots, while special occasions warranted the burning of precious spermaceti candles or the lighting of a whale oil lamp. Practical work requiring moderate light, such as spinning or whittling, could be accomplished by Betty lamplight, while detailed tasks, like fine sewing, might be reserved for days when better illumination was available. This pragmatic approach, using appropriate technology for each specific need, rather than adopting a single, best solution for all circumstances, characterized frontier innovation more broadly. Unlike urban dwellers who might discard older technologies entirely when newer options emerged, frontier families maintained multiple systems simultaneously, recognizing that each had particular advantages in specific situations. By 1845, Hammond's lighting practices had become standard throughout the county. Families routinely collected lighting materials throughout the year: pine knots in winter, when stumps were more accessible; rushes in summer, when they could be properly dried; bayberries in autumn, when they were ripe for picking. The iron Betty lamp, once considered primitive, became a staple in frontier households, valued for its simplicity and effectiveness. Silas Hammond continued to experiment with lighting methods, combining traditional practices with newer technologies. He developed a reflector system using polished tin sheets positioned behind various light sources to maximize illumination. He experimented with different wick materials and configurations, discovering that cotton carded in particular patterns burned more efficiently than random fibers. He even devised a primitive focusing lens from a glass bottle filled with water, which could intensify light for particular tasks. Hammond's workshop became an informal laboratory for lighting innovation. Visitors would find him testing different animal fats for burn quality, measuring illumination by the distance at which small print could be read, or experimenting with additives to reduce smoke and odor. His methodical approach, recording results in detailed journals, reflected a scientific mindset unusual for the frontier context. Hammond's experiments are worthy of a university professor, commented a traveling physician who visited in 1846. He applies rigorous testing to folk wisdom, discarding what proves ineffective and refining what shows promise. His practical discoveries about combustion and illumination parallel findings in European laboratories, yet he has derived them entirely through observation and experimentation. In the spring of 1848, a traveling lecturer visited the county courthouse to demonstrate another lighting innovation, camphene lamps. Also known as burning fluid, camphene was a mixture of turpentine, alcohol, and camphor oil that burned with exceptional brightness. The demonstration impressed many, but Hammond remained skeptical of the highly flammable substance. The lecturer filled a distinctive lamp with 2 angled wick tubes, carefully lighting each wick to produce a flame of remarkable brilliance. The assembled crowd murmured with appreciation as the light filled the courthouse with a brightness approaching daylight. Several farmers immediately placed orders for the lamps and fuel. Hammond studied the demonstration with particular interest, noting both the impressive illumination and the lecturer's extreme caution in handling the fuel. After the presentation, he approached the lecturer with specific questions about the composition of camphene and its safety characteristics. "It burns bright," he conceded after their discussion, "and the cost is reasonable compared to whale oil. But the danger cannot be overlooked. The vapors alone can ignite from a nearby flame, and a spilled lamp could engulf a room in fire within seconds." His caution proved prescient. In December 1848, news reached Clearfield County of a terrible accident in a neighboring settlement. A family had adopted camphene lighting only to have a lamp overturned during dinner. The resulting fire had claimed 2 lives and destroyed 3 buildings before being contained. The incident was not isolated. Similar accidents were reported from urban areas where camphene had become popular due to its lower cost compared to whale oil. The tragedy reinforced Hammond's philosophy that had now permeated the community. The best lighting methods balanced effectiveness with safety, cost, and available materials. By 1850, most homes in Clearfield County maintained a diverse array of lighting options: tallow candles for everyday use, pine knots for bright temporary light, rush lights for economy, lard oil lamps for extended use, and perhaps a whale oil lamp reserved for special occasions or particular tasks requiring better illumination. This diversified approach to lighting reflected a deeper frontier wisdom, the understanding that resilience comes from multiple options rather than dependence on any single method. Families no longer feared the darkening of winter evenings or the exhaustion of any particular lighting resource. If tallow ran short, pine knots could bridge the gap. If pine knots became scarce, rush lights could extend the supply. The community had achieved a kind of energy independence that would have been impossible with reliance on imported lighting fuels alone. The winter of 1852 brought another severe test as heavy snowfall again isolated the community. But this time, darkness did not accompany the isolation. Cabins throughout the county remained well lit, each family prepared with multiple lighting methods adapted to their particular needs and resources. The knowledge that had once resided solely with Silas Hammond had become community wisdom, passed between families and taught to apprentices as essential frontier craft. During this winter, Hammond introduced yet another lighting innovation, the grease lamp, a simple device that could burn rendered fat without the need for a wick. The lamp consisted of a shallow dish with a small spout at one edge. A piece of twisted cotton or linen was placed in the spout, with one end extending into the melted fat. The fabric acted as a conduit rather than a traditional wick, drawing the melted fat to the flame point through capillary action. The advantage, Hammond explained to interested neighbors, is that the grease lamp requires minimal maintenance. Unlike a wick that must be trimmed regularly, the fabric conduit rarely needs adjustment. The lamp will burn steadily for hours with no attention required. The grease lamp gained particular popularity among elderly residents who found the frequent trimming of traditional wicks challenging. Its steady, consistent light made it ideal for sleeping chambers, providing sufficient illumination for nighttime movement without requiring adjustment during the night. In spring of 1853, Samuel Wilkinson, now serving as county commissioner, proposed establishing a community notebook documenting various frontier lighting methods. Future generations should not have to rediscover what necessity has taught us, he argued at a town meeting. We should record this knowledge systematically while it remains fresh in our minds. The proposal was unanimously approved. Throughout summer, community members contributed their knowledge to what became known as the Clearfield Illumination Record. Hammond's techniques formed the core of the document, but others added their own innovations, methods for rendering various animal fats to reduce smoke, designs for reflective backing on wall-mounted lights to maximize brightness, techniques for treating rush wicks to extend burning time. James Hollister, a blacksmith who had adapted Hammond's lard lamp design, contributed detailed drawings of an improved holder that could be adjusted to direct light at various angles. Martha Hammond shared her method for twisting cotton threads into wicks that burned with minimal smoke. Agnes Hammond, now approaching 90 years of age, dictated her recollections of lighting methods used during the Revolutionary era, providing historical context for current practices. The completed record was stored in the county clerk's office, copied several times, and distributed to each church in the area for safekeeping. Additional copies were made for new families settling in the region. The document became a living repository of community knowledge, with additions and refinements noted in margins and on appended pages, as new techniques emerged or old ones were improved. The systematic recording of lighting methods represented an important shift in frontier knowledge management. Unlike earlier generations who relied primarily on oral transmission of practical skills, the Clearfield community recognized the value of written documentation for preserving and disseminating technical information. This transition from oral to written knowledge transfer reflected the community's growing sophistication and its commitment to building on accumulated wisdom, rather than repeatedly rediscovering basic techniques. In 1855, a traveling scientist from Philadelphia spent several days examining the Clearfield Illumination Record, expressing amazement at the sophisticated understanding of combustion principles embedded within the practical advice. These frontier adaptations, he wrote in his journal, reveal intuitive comprehension of scientific principles that formal laboratory experiments have only recently confirmed. The empirical wisdom of necessity sometimes outpaces the theoretical understanding of academia. The scientist was particularly impressed by Hammond's method for preparing pine knots, which included careful selection based on resin content and strategic cutting to optimize burning efficiency. Hammond has no formal understanding of the chemistry involved, the scientist noted. Yet, through careful observation and experimentation, he has developed a system that maximizes the combustion of volatile compounds while minimizing smoke production, precisely what our laboratory studies strive to achieve. Upon returning to Philadelphia, the scientist presented a paper on indigenous and frontier illumination technologies to the American Philosophical Society, citing the Clearfield Illumination Record extensively. The paper generated considerable interest among urban intellectuals, many of whom had never considered that sophisticated technical knowledge might emerge from frontier settlements rather than flow to them from established cities. In 1857, Hammond received a letter from the scientist requesting permission to publish portions of the Illumination Record in a forthcoming book on practical household technologies. Hammond responded affirmatively, stipulating only that the knowledge be attributed to the Clearfield community collectively rather than to himself individually. a request that reflected his understanding that the lighting methods had emerged from communal experience rather than singular invention. By 1859, as kerosene derived from coal and petroleum began to emerge as a lighting fuel, the residents of Clearfield County were well positioned to evaluate its merits against their established methods. Unlike communities that embraced kerosene without question, Clearfield families adopted it selectively, incorporating it into their existing lighting knowledge rather than abandoning traditional methods entirely. Kerosene offered significant advantages over previous commercial fuels. It burned brighter than tallow candles, produced less smoke than whale oil, cost substantially less than camphene, and posed fewer safety hazards. The introduction of kerosene coincided with the development of improved lamp designs that featured enhanced combustion systems and more effective chimneys to protect the flame from drafts. When the first traveling salesman arrived selling kerosene lamps in 1860, he was surprised to find potential customers asking sophisticated questions about combustion efficiency, safety factors, and comparative costs against their existing methods. The frontier community that might have been seen as backward had become discerning consumers of lighting technology, making informed choices based on hard-won experience. These people know more about lighting than most city dwellers, the salesman wrote to his employer. They understand the fundamental principles and evaluate new technologies against practical criteria rather than being swayed by novelty alone. I sold fewer lamps than expected, but engaged in more meaningful discussions about lighting than I've had in all my previous travels combined. The Clearfield approach to kerosene adoption was characteristically pragmatic. Rather than immediately replacing all existing lighting methods with a new technology, families incorporated kerosene lamps into their existing systems. The kerosene lamp might serve for primary evening illumination in the main living area, while traditional methods continued to serve in workshops, barns, and for specific tasks, where their particular characteristics proved advantageous. The community's relationship with lighting had evolved beyond mere utility. Light had become a metaphor for frontier resilience, the ability to push back darkness through knowledge, preparation, and adaptability rather than dependency on external supplies or technologies. This metaphorical understanding found expression in community celebrations and traditions. In 1862, during the darkest period of the Civil War, the community established an annual Festival of Lights, held on the winter solstice. Each family brought examples of their preferred lighting methods to the town square, creating a magnificent display that demonstrated both the diversity of techniques and their collective illuminating power. The festival became both practical demonstration and symbolic reminder of community self-reliance during difficult times. The first Festival of Lights featured over 30 different lighting implementations, from the crudest slut lamp to the most sophisticated argand lamp. Hammond arranged the display systematically, organizing the lights by fuel type, technology, and historical development. The resulting exhibition provided both practical education and aesthetic pleasure, the varying colors and intensities of the flames creating a living tableau of frontier ingenuity. Reverend Mitchell opened the festival with a brief address that captured its symbolic significance. On this longest night of the year, we gather not to curse the darkness, but to celebrate our capacity to create light. Each flame represents not only practical knowledge, but spiritual truth, the understanding that illumination comes in many forms, and that wisdom lies in knowing which light best serves each particular need. The festival concluded with a communal meal served by lamplight, followed by storytelling and music that extended well into the night. What began as a practical response to winter darkness evolved into a celebration of community identity and shared values, an annual reminder that collective knowledge and mutual support could overcome even the most challenging circumstances. Meanwhile, commercial lighting technology continued to evolve. In 1865, Silas Hammond, then in his 60s, traveled to Pittsburgh to examine the latest innovations. He returned with a coal oil lamp that burned kerosene derived from coal rather than petroleum. The lamp produced impressive illumination with relatively little smoke, yet Hammond's evaluation remained measured. "It burns well," he reported to neighbors gathered to see the new device, "and the fuel costs less than whale oil. But consider that the kerosene must be purchased with cash money, while our traditional methods require mainly time and knowledge. In good years, when cash is plentiful, these new lamps offer convenience. In lean years, when money is scarce, our traditional methods ensure we're never without light." Hammond's perspective reflected the frontier's complex relationship with market capitalism and self-sufficiency. Unlike urban consumers who increasingly depended on manufactured goods and commercial services, frontier families maintained the capacity to produce essentials locally when necessary. This dual economy, participating in commercial networks while maintaining alternative production capabilities, characterized frontier communities more broadly and contributed significantly to their resilience during economic downturns and supply disruptions. In 1869, county records note a visit from a professor of applied sciences from Philadelphia who had heard about the Clearfield illumination record and traveled specifically to examine it. He reportedly expressed astonishment at the comprehensive nature of the document, commenting that it contained practical knowledge that exceeded much of what was taught in Eastern academic institutions regarding lighting efficiency. The original Silas Hammond, by then in his 70s, received the professor's visit with characteristic modesty. "Necessity taught us what comfort might never have revealed," he reportedly said. "When darkness threatens and resources are limited, innovation follows naturally." The professor was particularly interested in Hammond's experiments with vegetable oils as lighting fuels. Hammond had discovered that certain plants, particularly those with oily seeds like sunflowers, could be processed to yield oils suitable for lamp use. Though the illumination was not as bright as that produced by animal fats or whale oil, the vegetable alternatives offered significant advantages. They could be grown rather than hunted or purchased. They produced less offensive odor when burning, and they remained liquid at lower temperatures than animal fats. The professor's subsequent paper on frontier illumination practices, published in a respected scientific journal, brought wider recognition to Hammond's methods. The paper noted that Hammond had independently discovered principles of oil refinement that paralleled those being developed in European laboratories, despite having no formal scientific training. This recognition of frontier innovation represented an important shift in 19th century intellectual perspectives. Earlier attitudes had often dismissed frontier settlements as culturally and technologically backward, places where civilization's refinements were sacrificed to survival's necessities. The professor's acknowledgement that sophisticated technical knowledge could emerge from practical frontier experience challenged this hierarchical view, suggesting instead that different environments might produce different but equally valuable forms of innovation. In 1873, with the arrival of the railroad just 30 miles south, factory-made kerosene lamps became increasingly common throughout the region. Yet a survey conducted that year revealed that over 60% of Clearfield County households still maintained traditional lighting methods alongside these newer technologies. Pine knots remained popular for outdoor lighting. Rush lights continued to serve as economical options for routine tasks. And Betty lamps still illuminated many workshops where the risk of fire from kerosene was deemed too great. This blending of old and new technologies characterized the frontier approach to innovation, pragmatic adoption, rather than wholesale replacement. When kerosene prices fluctuated wildly following economic panics, families fell back on traditional lighting methods. When harsh winter weather interrupted supply lines, homemade lighting solutions ensured continued illumination. The community had achieved a resilience that purely commercial lighting could not provide. The winter of 1875-76 brought the final vindication of Hammond's philosophy. A prolonged disruption in kerosene supplies caused by railroad delays left many communities in western Pennsylvania inadequately lit during the darkest months. Clearfield County, however, maintained normal activities, drawing upon their diverse lighting methods to compensate for the shortage of commercial fuel. The Hammond method, as it had come to be called, gained wider recognition following this incident. Neighboring counties sent representatives to learn the various lighting techniques that had proven so effective during the supply disruption. The Clearfield illumination record was copied and distributed more widely, its practical wisdom finding application well beyond the community that had developed it. In February 1876, a regional newspaper published an article titled "Lessons from Clearfield: How Traditional Knowledge Illuminated a Modern Crisis." The piece detailed how the county had maintained normal functions despite the kerosene shortage, attributing this resilience to the community's maintenance of diverse lighting technologies. The article concluded with a pointed observation: perhaps true progress lies not in abandoning old ways for new, but in maintaining multiple capabilities to address life's unpredictable challenges. When Silas Hammond passed away in the spring of 1877, his funeral was attended by nearly every family in the county. The service, held after sundown by community request, was illuminated entirely by traditional lighting methods. Pine knot torches lined the path to the church. Bayberry candles adorned the altar. Rushlights and Betty lamps provided soft illumination throughout the sanctuary. It was, many noted, a fitting tribute to a man whose foresight had literally brought light to the community during its darkest hours. In his eulogy, Reverend Mitchell reflected on the broader significance of Hammond's contribution. Silas taught us that true security lies not in having the newest innovation, but in possessing the knowledge to adapt to changing circumstances, he said. He showed us that wisdom often resides in remembering what others have forgotten, and that the most valuable legacy we leave is not what we accumulate, but what we teach others. Following the funeral, the community established the Hammond Lighting Collection, a permanent display housed in the county courthouse that preserved examples of the various lighting methods Hammond had championed. The collection served both as historical record and practical resource, allowing new residents to examine and understand the diverse lighting options available to frontier households. As the 19th century drew to a close, electric lighting began to emerge in larger urban centers. News of Thomas Edison's successful demonstration of an incandescent electric light system in 1879 reached Clearfield County through newspapers and travelers' accounts. The community regarded this development with the same practical evaluation they had applied to previous lighting innovations. Electricity may indeed be the illumination of the future, Samuel Wilkinson, now in his 70s, observed at a town meeting where the news was discussed. But until electric wires reach our remote valley, we would do well to maintain our traditional knowledge. Even then, as Hammond would remind us, dependence on any single method leaves us vulnerable to disruption. The Clearfield illumination record was preserved through subsequent generations, updated periodically with new information and technological developments. In 1901, as electric lighting began to appear in larger towns nearby, a note was added to the record's introduction. The methods contained herein represent more than mere techniques for creating light. They embody the frontier principles of self-reliance, resourcefulness, and community wisdom. As newer technologies emerge, these principles remain relevant, reminding us that true security lies not in dependence on any single method or technology, but in knowledge, preparation, and adaptability. When electricity finally reached Clearfield County in 1923, the transition occurred gradually rather than abruptly. Many households maintained their kerosene lamps alongside electric fixtures, recognizing that power outages were common in rural areas, particularly during winter storms. The knowledge of traditional lighting methods, though less frequently practiced, continued to be preserved and occasionally implemented when circumstances required. A photographic copy of the original Clearfield illumination record, made in 1938, was eventually housed in the Pennsylvania State Archives. Historians studying frontier life have noted the extraordinary level of detail contained in the record, particularly regarding the practical integration of indigenous knowledge with European techniques and emerging industrial technologies. The record reveals much about the resourcefulness of frontier communities, how they adapted to material constraints through knowledge and innovation, how they developed sophisticated understanding of natural processes through careful observation, and how they created resilience through diversification rather than specialization. Modern researchers studying sustainable living practices have found valuable insights in these frontier approaches to resource management and technological adaptation. In 1954, during the renovation of the old county courthouse, workers discovered a small metal box sealed within a cornerstone. Inside was a letter dated 1878 and signed by Samuel Wilkinson. It read, in part, "To those who find this message, the light you enjoy today may come from sources we cannot imagine, but remember that in times of greatest darkness, our community found illumination not primarily through advanced technology, but through shared knowledge, careful preparation, and the understanding that wisdom often lies in having many options rather than depending solely on what seems most advanced or convenient. May you never take for granted the simple miracle of pushing back darkness, and may you always keep alternative paths forward when the main road is obscured." The letter was accompanied by a small pine knot wrapped in preserved rushes, a symbolic representation of the lighting methods that had sustained the community through difficult times. These artifacts now reside in the County Historical Society, tangible reminders of a time when light was not taken for granted, but actively created through knowledge and effort. In 1972, during the energy crisis that affected much of the United States, interest in the Clearfield illumination record resurged. Several local families dusted off traditional lighting methods as electricity became expensive and occasionally unreliable. The County Historical Society organized workshops demonstrating rush lights, Betty lamps, and pine knot lighting, drawing upon the detailed instructions preserved in the record. These ancient technologies, once considered obsolete, found renewed relevance in changed economic circumstances. Today, descendants of Clearfield County's original settlers still tell the story of the light winter of 1842-43, when a community discovered that preparation trumps prosperity, diversity of methods overcomes dependency, and knowledge shared becomes wisdom multiplied. The legacy of Silas Hammond reminds us that true frontier innovation often involves rediscovering and adapting ancient wisdom, rather than merely embracing the newest technology, a lesson that remains relevant in our modern world where convenience sometimes obscures resilience and progress is occasionally measured by what we've discarded rather than what we've preserved. The evolution of lighting in frontier America reflects a broader pattern of technological adaptation, the gradual shift from indigenous and improvised methods to commercially manufactured products. Pine knots and rush lights gave way to tallow and spermaceti candles. These were supplemented by whale oil and lard oil lamps. These in turn were replaced by kerosene lamps. And finally, electric lighting superseded all previous methods. Yet the Clearfield County experience suggests that this progression was neither inevitable nor entirely beneficial. The community's multi-method approach to lighting, maintaining traditional techniques alongside newer technologies, created a resilience that pure technological progression could not provide. This hybrid approach, balancing innovation with tradition, represents a model of technological adoption that modern communities might well consider as they face uncertainties in energy supply and environmental sustainability. Ironically, many of Hammond's lighting methods have experienced renewed interest in recent decades. Artisanal candle making has reemerged as both hobby and commercial enterprise. Rustic lighting, including pine knot torches, has become fashionable in outdoor settings. Heritage museums demonstrate traditional lighting technologies to audiences fascinated by their ingenuity and simplicity. What Hammond preserved from practical necessity, we now rediscover for historical appreciation and aesthetic pleasure. Perhaps most significantly, the frontier philosophy that Hammond embodied, the value of maintaining multiple options rather than depending on single solutions, has found renewed relevance in contemporary discussions of resilience and sustainability. As modern communities face challenges from climate change, energy transitions, and technological vulnerabilities, the Clearfield model of technological diversity offers valuable perspectives on maintaining essential services through changing circumstances. In the words Hammond himself added to the final page of the Clearfield Illumination Record, light, like knowledge, is most valuable when derived from multiple sources. For just as no single star can adequately illuminate the night sky, no single method of creating light can fully address all human needs. Wisdom lies in maintaining many options, especially for things as essential as pushing back darkness. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of Silas Hammond and the Clearfield County lighting practices is not the specific techniques they developed, but the philosophy underlying them, the understanding that technological progress is not merely about replacing old methods with new ones, but about expanding the range of options available to meet human needs. In this view, the most advanced society is not necessarily the one with the newest technology, but the one with the most diverse and adaptable approaches to fundamental challenges. As we face contemporary uncertainties in energy supply, environmental sustainability, and technological dependency, the frontier wisdom of Clearfield County offers a valuable perspective, reminding us that resilience comes not from commitment to any particular technology, but from the knowledge and adaptability to use many different approaches as circumstances require. In this sense, the light that Hammond brought to his community continues to illuminate our understanding of technology and progress even today.